In 1948, one of the most iconic Christmas songs we listened to and still sing today was written by two guys you've probably never heard of. And although it was fairly well received at the time, it wasn't until a decade later, when Elvis Presley recorded the song, that it was cemented as a holiday classic. Any guesses as to what song I'm referring to? I'll give you another hint. The lyrics of the song themselves express a deep sense of sorrow and heartbreak. But when combined with Elvis's velvety smooth baritone, it so vividly captures the emotional reality that many of us may feel during this season. I think you know the song, right? I'll have a blue... Never mind. I'm going to stick to my lane. But it's Blue Christmas, okay? When most of our Christmas songs are filled with lyrics about sleigh rides and snowflakes, decking halls and trimming trees, magic and merriment, a weird one about a grandma becoming roadkill. I still don't get that one. How does a song like Blue Christmas make the holiday hits list? Well, I think it's because for many of us, this season is not one of perpetual joy, but a vivid reminder of the absence of joy, the ache of loss, or the loneliness that feels more acute in the winter months. The pressure to be happy and festive only magnifies the internal struggle of pain or sorrow. For some of us, this past year held the loss of a job, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a dream. For others in our community, it brought about a broken heart, an unwanted diagnosis, an empty home, a deep depression. Perhaps it's what this year didn't bring that was the most painful to endure. There's still a lonely void, a strained relationship, an empty womb, a chronic illness. If we're honest, there are many of us who enter this holiday season and we're simply trying to hold on until it's over and just hope we make it through to the other side. And amid all of this, the question that arises is, where's God in this pain? If the Christmas season is all about celebrating God's presence with us, how do we begin to experience that presence when everything around us feels bleak? Well, that's where we're heading today. And we're going to start by looking at one of my favorite stories in the New Testament. It's found in John chapter 9. And so you can grab your Bible and turn there now. The story begins with the news that Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, is gravely ill. And we know from other stories in the Gospels that these three siblings are some of Jesus's closest friends. And so the sisters, they send word to Jesus, hoping he will come quickly and he'll heal their brother. The text tells us that Jesus stayed where he was for 2 more days before heading to the town of Bethany, where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived. And right away, from the very start, we're faced with the uncomfortable and disorienting reality that God's timeline doesn't often align with ours. Right? Those moments when we're left wondering why God doesn't seem to act as quickly as we'd like. The times where we even are feeling abandoned, forgotten by God. Does he not know? Or worse, does he not care? When Jesus finally gets to Bethany, he arrives at the ancient equivalent of a funeral. And it's here where we'll pick up the story, starting in verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, that's an important detail because ancient rabbinic tradition had it that a loved one should visit the tomb of a dead person after 3 days to ensure that they were really dead. So Jesus, arriving on day 4, is the Apostle John, who wrote this book. It's his very Jewish way of saying Lazarus was super dead. And what follows is Jesus' encounter with each sister, with Mary and with Martha, as they are grieving this loss of their brother. Each sister actually says the same thing to Jesus. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Their words are identical, but their posture, the way they say it, it's entirely different. Martha actually goes out to meet Jesus immediately, speaking to him face to face, appearing to process the events that have just transpired, the grief that's taken over in a mostly intellectual way. Mary, on the other hand, delays. She only goes to see Jesus after Martha returns to the house and tells her, hey, Jesus is asking for you. Mary then goes to him and says the same thing to Jesus, but from her knees, not face to face, but on the ground, weeping, appearing to process the events that have just transpired and the grief that's taken over in a primarily emotional way. Martha and Mary's words are filled with pain and confusion, and they know Jesus could have healed their brother, but now it seems too late. Two different women, two different responses to grief. One trying to intellectually understand it, wanting answers for her grief. The other trying to emotionally understand it, wanting comfort for her grief. And Jesus meets them both where they're at, making space for them to be and process exactly as they need to. And the first thing I want us to remember today is that God meets us where we are, not where we pretend to be. God can only be present with us exactly where we are, not where we think we should be, where we hope we would be, where others may expect us to be. He is present with us exactly where we are. Jesus, he's present with Martha, then he's present with Mary, and it's as Mary is weeping with Jesus that something surprising happens. Look at verse 33. When Jesus saw her, being Mary, weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And at this point, we encounter one of the most profound and deeply human moments in the Gospels. John 11:35 is the shortest verse in all of Scripture. It's just 2 words. Jesus wept. And the question these 2 words implore us to ask is, why? Why is Jesus weeping? I mean, it's not because he's grieving the loss of his friend Lazarus. At this point in the story, Jesus has already stated twice, once to his disciples and once to Martha, that Lazarus would rise again. He knows there's a happily ever after just around the corner. So why does he weep? Jesus weeps when he sees Mary and the others grieving. He weeps over the chaos that sin has released in the world and on humanity. He weeps over the reality of death, a reality that was never supposed to be a part of God's original design for his creation. Jesus weeps over the havoc and heartbreak that death causes to those he loves. Jesus wept. You know, the heart of the Christmas story is not just about the birth of a baby, but the arrival of God in the flesh. God could have chosen to remain distant from the pain of the world, but instead he chose to come near. Matthew 1:23 tells us that the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. This means that Jesus is not aloof to or unaffected by our sorrow. He doesn't ignore our pain or ask us to suppress our emotions. He enters our suffering and is present with us in our grief, in the pain, the heartache, the loneliness we are walking through. He's not above it or outside of it, but in it. He's with us. Ours is a God who does not run away from the messes, but enters into them. Jesus wept. You know, a couple weeks ago, I was at a thrift store, and I found the entire set of the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis all together in one book for literally $4, guys, the deal of the century. I was so ecstatic. And at that moment, all of this nostalgia of reading this series as a kid, it came rushing back to me. And so, of course, I bought it and I bring it home. And my two older boys are 8.5 and 6. And I'm like, boys, I just found this amazing book. I read it as a kid and it's one of my absolute favorite series. And I'm going to read it to you guys each night as we're getting ready for bed. And it's going to be incredible. You're going to love it so much. I can't wait for you to go through it with me. And I'm just like overflowing with excitement over this fun new bedtime routine we'll have. And of course, I mean, their level of enthusiasm completely matched my level of enthusiasm. No. They were like, I don't care, Mom. And I'm like, no, but you don't understand. It's going to be awesome. And I show them the book and the cover looks cool. And they just say, I don't want you to read it to me. I want to read it by myself. And then they actually start flipping through it and they see how big the book is. And they're both like, never mind. I don't want to read it at all. And my heart was broken. Sad day. We've yet to start it, but I will warm them up to it. But all of this made me think of the first book in this series. It's called The Magician's Nephew. And in it, Diggory, the protagonist, he approaches Aslan, a lion that represents Jesus. And he approaches him with a question. See, Diggory's mother is dying, and there's no cure for her condition. And so when this little boy finds himself accidentally in a magical world, he approaches Aslan to see if he might be able to offer some type of cure, some kind of miracle for his mom. And here's how the scene plays out. Diggory asks Aslan if possibly he could give him something magical that would make his mother well. And then it says this, he, being Diggory, had been desperately hoping that the lion would say yes. He had been horribly afraid it might say no. But he was taken aback when it did neither. In the face of real, critical, life-threatening need, Diggory, he worked up the nerve to ask. And then God was silent. And anytime I read this part of the book, I can't help but get choked up and holding back tears because I've been there too. Right? It's a story about a boy talking to a lion, but it's also a story about grief. It's a story about working up the nerve to ask God for that which you most desire. And it's a story about the disappointment of apparently unanswered prayer. And in the next chapter, Diggory works up the nerve to ask Aslan a second time. He says, but please, won't you, can't you give me something that will cure Mother? Up till then, he had been looking at the lion's great feet and the huge claws on them. And now, in his despair, he looked up at its face. What he saw surprised him as much as anything in his whole life. For the tawny face was bent down near his own, and wonder of wonders, great shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. They were such big, bright tears compared with Diggory's own that for a moment he felt as if the lion must really be sorrier about his mother than he was himself. Diggory saw grief, sorrow, and a deep, deep sense of care. And Diggory was an autobiographical character for C.S. Lewis. Lewis actually added this book much later, even though it's the first in the story narratively. You see, C.S. Lewis, like Diggory, grew up with a single mother, and C.S. Lewis, like Diggory, lost his mother at age 10. And Lewis, who is this incredible philosopher and theologian, decades removed, was still processing the painful experience and tension that we live in with Jesus through this fable. Like Mary and Martha, Lewis didn't get his every question answered, but he saw tears in the eyes of Jesus. And that changed the way he was asking those questions. Or maybe it answered the most important question that lies beneath all of those other questions. Jesus weeps with the weeping. He grieves with the grieving. And that doesn't answer all our questions, but it answers the question that makes all the other questions bearable. That even if there's mystery behind the why of suffering, we know how God feels about suffering. It breaks his heart. It moves him emotionally. I mean, throughout the pages of Scripture, God is described again and again as compassionate. It's a word literally meaning co-suffering. He's the one who feels our pain, who grieves alongside us, who weeps at what hurts us. Jesus came not to offer us easy answers, but to offer himself, to be with us in our pain, to transform our sorrow, to give us hope. Some of us are so focused on getting answers to our why questions that we're missing out on his presence altogether. See, Jesus does not always give me answers, but he always gives me his presence. The story continues in John 11, where Jesus, he goes to Lazarus' tomb and he asks them to remove the stone covering the entrance. And Martha's response is, but Lord, there's going to be an odor. I mean, he's been dead for 4 days. But Jesus is unaffected by that reality, and he persists. So they take away the stone, and Jesus prays to his Father. And then in verse 43, it says, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. The happy ending is here. Lazarus lives. It's a miracle. Grief turned into joy, mourning turned into laughter. And this story sets the stage for Jesus' own death and resurrection that are just around the corner. But here is where it gets tough. Because many of us have prayed similar prayers. We've cried out for a miracle, for something that seems dead to be brought back to life, for something that is broken to be healed, something that is missing to be restored, seemingly to no avail. Our happily ever after is still out of reach. And this is the tension we live in. It's what theologians call the already, not yet. The reality that Jesus has already been victorious over sin and death. And we can know that victory here and now. That God's kingdom is already present in our world. That resurrection life, as Pastor Steve talked about in part 1, it's invading earth right now. And it won't stop until every square inch has been redeemed. But the full experience of that victory is something we're still waiting on when Jesus comes again. Already and not yet. You know, the month leading up to Christmas is often called Advent, which simply means coming. But it's just referencing Jesus's first coming, right? 2,000 plus years ago when he was born in Bethlehem as a baby. But Christians, we believe that there will be another Advent, a second coming. And this is why we look back to Jesus's first Advent to remind us that he is present with us. But at the same time, we are a people who also look forward to Jesus' second advent, his second coming, to remember that our story is not done yet. We hold on to hope now, not because life is exactly as it should be. No, we hold on to hope now because we believe that one day all hope will disappear. And that may sound like a bad thing, but let me tell you why it is, in fact, a very, very good thing. You see, in 1 Corinthians 13, the Apostle Paul concludes his famous chapter, what is often called the love chapter, with these words. He says, and now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Why is love the greatest of those three virtues? Well, because love is the only virtue that's eternal. Think about it. If faith is belief in what is not seen, we will not need faith in eternity because we will know and experience God fully. If hope is the anticipation of something yet to be received, we will not need hope in eternity because all of our hopes will be fulfilled and complete in Jesus. When Jesus returns and restores all things, when all that is wrong in our world and in our relationships and within ourselves is once and for all made right, that's the day hope disappears. And it will be an incredible day. And so in the meantime, in the already and the not yet, the gift that Advent offers us is the space to acknowledge that all is not yet as it should be. We don't have to pretend that all is calm and all is bright when we know that it's not. No, Advent allows us to name the reality of difficulties in our personal lives, of despair and harm throughout the world, and then invites us to stubbornly insist that this is not the whole story. To cling to hope in the midst of our uncertainty, in the midst of our waiting, because Advent reminds us of where our hope truly lies. Our hope as Christians is not rooted in an escape from suffering, but in the knowledge that God will one day make all things right. The story of Christmas is the beginning of God's redemptive plan for the world, a plan that ultimately culminates in the second Advent, the second coming of Christ, when he will wipe away every tear from our eyes and make all things new. So this Christmas, if you find yourself experiencing sorrow or grief, remember this: you are not alone. God is with you. And amid your blue Christmas, the light of Christ shines. It's a light that does not ignore your pain, but one that illuminates it with hope. We're going to close with a familiar song, "O Come All Ye Faithful." But the words have been changed a bit to acknowledge the reality that some of us are experiencing in this season. For some, this is your first Christmas divorced, without a loved one, as an empty nester. Perhaps it's your first Christmas with an illness, without a job, or some other reality you're facing currently. I want to close our time together by creating space for you to be exactly as you need to be. As our worship leaders sing this song, my prayer is that you would be able to come to God exactly as you are, with your grief, your pain, your anger, your heartache, and that it's there you would experience his presence with you. That you would know that God is not a distant God who watches from afar. He enters into our suffering. He walks with us through our darkest valleys. He's a God who weeps with us. And he promises that the pain we experience now is not the end of the story.
Hey, wait, before you go, 3 things. First, consider becoming one of Cornerstone Fellowship's financial partners. Your donations will ensure that you'll be able to continue enjoying helpful and hopefully life-changing messages like the one you just watched. And then number 2, please share the link to this message with anyone who you know needs it or will be blessed by it, or by posting the link to your own personal social media platforms, all of them. And finally, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you'll be alerted whenever we post more content. Thanks for watching.